Welcome. Go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar on using story maps for teaching. I am going to briefly just introduce our first speaker, and we have three speakers. Our first speaker be Chris Saladin, who is currently a PhD student in the history department at the University of Minnesota, and I will
All right, I'll go ahead and jump in then. I think Michelle might have cut out there. So give me a second to share my screen. But all right, here we go. Okay, so hi everyone. Like Michelle mentioned, my name is Chris Saladin, and I am a fourth year PhD student in the history department at the University of Minnesota. But I have spent really my last 3 years at the U kind of getting into the world of digital mapping and sort of GIS, both in my research and in my teaching appointments and such. And really the way that I got introduced to all this was through story maps. So basically, when I was actually in a seminar, I was taking a seminar with Kathryn Reyerson, who is one of the speakers here today. And we were given the option to do as our final seminar project, a sort of story map project instead of a normal seminar paper. And I decided to give it a go, thinking that it would be less work for the semester. It turned out that that was not really the case. It in some ways turned out to be more work than a seminar paper would have been, but was much more rewarding and got me really into mapping. So this was actually the map that I started out making. This is my very first story map. And you can see basically what a story map is. It's we're specifically talking about a story map platform that's designed by the company Esri, who's kind of the maker of they're the biggest GIS company. And basically the elements that tend to make up a story map are text, maps, and then also images as well. So it's sort of bringing multiple types of media together into these partially like interactive elements. And so this is sort of those first maps that I created. And yeah, so from there, I then started working with a group called the StoryMaps curriculum team at the University of Minnesota. And basically this is just a group of people from Lattice, the libraries, the group Use Spatial, who work to promote teaching with story maps, mostly all across sort of the College of Liberal Arts. And I'll mention my work with them a little bit more towards the end, but basically with story maps, the way that we sort of approached it is that there's multiple kinds of assignments that people can do with story maps. It's not just a one size fits all thing. There are sort of multiple sort of levels that you can get involved with story maps. It can be something that is a sort of all semester project, either for undergrads or graduate students like I did, or it can be something that is done in a very short period of time too, or it can be a sort of repeated assignment throughout the semester. So this is from a website that I'll mention kind of towards the end as a potential resource. But basically, there's sort of 3 different main types of assignments that I've worked with story maps. So those first ones are just individual research projects. This is where a student is sort of making their own story map. And I'm actually going to show an example from Kay's class real quick. So this here was a map that we made of sort of imagined medieval cities. And I think Kay might get into this assignment more. But for each one of these sort of cities that a student designed, they made their own story map. So I have one of those opened up here. And you can see that basically the student on their own wrote sort of this description of a city that they then designed, and is displayed in these maps on the right. And these maps are interactive. So if you click on them, it'll actually tell you a little more about what the object is that's there. But yeah, this is just an example sort of one project of what a student was able to do in sort of a main project over the course of the semester. Make this fairly, in this case, pretty elaborate map of an imagined medieval city, and then they're able to sort of pair it with that text on the other side. And this is using, I should mention, there's kind of two different platforms of story maps. So there's the new story maps, and then there's StoryMaps Classic. And you'll see as I show examples, sort of two different platforms. And that new story maps, which is what this is, has replaced sort of the classic template, which is like what I built my original map in, for example. So that's why the interfaces look a little different. They've been updating the program in the last couple of years. So there's these individual projects like this. And then the next are sort of group projects. And I would actually say these are the most common ones I've worked with in all sorts of classes, not just, I've worked a lot with history classes, but I've also worked with sociology a little bit. And then I've worked with, in this case, this was a history of science and technology class. So this is really applicable to a lot of different fields, but most of my examples are kind of pre-modern history. But in this case, basically, this is a collection of story maps that were created by a whole class. And then when I click into one of these, this is a story map that's created by a single group. So it's a group of like 5 or 6 students, I think it was in the case of this class. And these students completed this assignment over the course of about 3 weeks. They were introduced to how to do story maps. Then we had a workshop where they were actually started building their maps, and then they sort of had time to make the finished product. And the nice thing about this kind of newer version of story maps is you can make 2 kinds of maps. In this case, this is an express map, which is very easy to sort of jump into. And it's basically just kind of like, I just call it doodling on a map. It's very easy just to quickly draw features on there. And then when you hover over them, well, sometimes it'll tell you what what the object is if they put a label. So there's like the location of the pyramids, for example. This is in contrast to, this map doesn't have it, but this is in contrast to like on that original map I showed you. This was an actual ArcGIS web map that I designed and input the data for. And it's a little more complex of a process, and it's something that I can point you towards the resources of how to make these kinds of GIS maps. But these sort of express maps are a much quicker thing that students can kind of jump into for a shorter project. And I've worked with both, having students either do the more advanced ArcGIS web maps or these express maps. Now, the last kind of type of assignment that I want to mention, so I mentioned the individual, the group, then I've also worked with these ones that are more sort of class-wide assignments. And this is using a program this is combining a program called Survey 123 and Story Maps. And basically Survey 123, here's actually an example of one. It's basically just a survey software that also will pin survey answers to a geographic location. So in this case, I designed just basic questions related to a topic, and then the students also have to pin it to a specific location. And basically what that does is it then generates a sort of collective map of all the data. So this is a really great way to get a class sort of collectively making a map by submitting multiple points. Each student submits a point, and then it makes a class-wide map. And for this one, this was for a Greek history class that I TA'd for. And we had the students do 7 different entries on different specific topics from Greek history. One of these, the entry I'm showing here, was the students were given the list of Homer's catalog of ships, which is a very infamously boring passage of the Iliad, which lists out sort of the specific location that every ship that served for the Greek forces came from, and the amount of troops they had, and all sorts of stuff like that. So when you look at this list, it's basically incomprehensible. I mean, it's just sort of a list of names and places. But then when we assigned students specific locations from the catalog of ships, and then they had to find them and map them, then the catalog suddenly becomes a much more interesting and powerful image when it's sort of put on a map. So this then are the locations that are mentioned in the catalog of ships, at least the confirmable ones. Some of them weren't real places. But then you can see, if I click on one of these, that each individual point is a location from that catalog, and it was entered by an individual student. But then together, we actually can kind of get this bigger picture that they may not get if they're trying to understand this material on their own. And the other cool thing about this is that you can visualize the data in multiple ways. So this is the same data set, but here I'm representing sort of the concentration of the number of ships that the contingent was said to have brought. So you sort of get an idea of the concentration of where most of those places are, most of the ships are coming from, or said to be coming from. So you can kind of see how from this one data set that's a fairly easy, just single survey submission for a student, you can get sort of this bigger class-wide data set that you can use to visualize really interesting things. And I did a bunch of other ones for this assignment, and I've worked with other classes as well doing these kinds of assignments, and I'm happy to share more examples of that as well at the end if people are interested. But yeah, like I mentioned, these maps can be all sorts of levels of complexity, and it's really just kind of up to your comfort level of how much you want to get involved in that. If you have more of the complex mapping going on, I recommend actually working, if you're not familiar with StoryMaps for GIS, actually working with one of the academic technologists that's part of this StoryMaps curriculum team. And basically, this, like I mentioned, this is a group that combines people from the libraries, Lattice, and Use Spatial. And we actually designed this through our work with different classes. From the experience we gained, we designed this resources website, storymaps.umn.edu. And I can share the link for that in the chat here in a bit. But basically here you'll find resources both for instructors who are designing and running assignments, and then also for students who are maybe working on assignments and want quick how-tos of how to do story maps. And then there's also a gallery of sort of many of the different student story maps that have come out of the projects that team has worked with. So I encourage you to sort of go in and browse through these. You'll see a lot of examples from Kay's class, for example, many of Kay's classes that have worked with story maps. And yeah, I guess the last thing to mention with this, oh, that's the UMN website. The last thing to mention with the StoryMaps curriculum portal is that if you want to get in contact with people who will help you with your class, whether it's designing the assignment or actually running it, and you want someone to come in and do a workshop with your students, I encourage you to email storymaps@umn.edu. There's a team of people who are usually very happy to help, and we'll try to help you come up with an assignment. So that's kind of what I have to say. So that's kind of an overview of StoryMaps and sort of my experience with different types of assignments. And yeah, I will now hand it off to Kay to talk a little more in detail about some of the assignments that she's done in her classes. So.
Actually, I think it's going to John first.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, I can try to pipe in and introduce Dr. John Menke, right? A former PhD student in the Department of History and now a doctor in the philosophy of history. And I will let you elaborate on your project.
Yeah, so as was just mentioned, I'm an alumnus of the PhD department or the history department here at the U, and I was a student of Kay's. And so I was asked to speak here today because of a collaborative project that I undertook with Professor Reyerson before graduating that had a digital mapping component. And in a little bit here, I'll show you some stills from that project. And Chris began our discussion with a really good overview of this technology and the resources available. And so I want to talk about some observations that we made based on this experience, as well as go into a little, some aspect of kind of the nuts and bolts of making this very briefly. Because I think that that's really important. That's a really important thing that students can take away from working with digital mapping technology. But before I do that, I want to give kind of a brief overview of what we were trying to do in just a couple of minutes, so you're not completely lost when I start pointing at things on a map. Basically, what we wanted to do is Professor Reyerson had a hypothesis that we could map violence in the Mediterranean onto a spectrum. So pitched battle might lead into more irregular warfare, particularly piracy, and that that relationship could go in the other direction. So piracy could coalesce into more formalized military violence, a battle, something like that. And so contingent to this was a desire to explore the potential of digital mapping to present a historical argument such as this. So I was kind of Professor Reyerson's guinea pig in getting graduate students to engage with this sort of material. And so the idea was we would call medieval chronicles for examples of violence, and we quickly because of the need to look at so many sources as well as learn this new technology, we decided to limit our exploration to the War of Sicilian Vespers, because there is a great variety of sources relating to this. We have old Italian chronicles, Sicilian language chronicles, Catalan chronicles, Latin chronicles. So we could really pull from a variety of sources. And what we really did is we ended up, so I am going to show some stills here. Oh, shoot. So it is not.
Can you share your screen, or
Yeah, I'm trying to.
maybe we have to give you, I don't know, Lauren, can you?
I already made him co-host.
Oh, okay.
From Zoom's perspective, he has permission.
Oh, hold on. Oh, I see.
You have to claim host.
Yeah, and I need to give it. You know, it's telling me that I'm going to have to quit and reopen. So should we pass it off to Kay and then I can bring up the rear, I guess, so to speak? And I can re-enter this because Zoom is not being particularly helpful. I can get in pretty quickly, I'm sure, but it's not going to let me share my screen until I do so.
I know. Okay, would you rather move to you, or do you want to just wait for a minute and let John come back in?
I'm happy to do either. I can give my presentation. It does link with Chris's material. So
All right, I'm sorry. I'll come right back.
Okay.
One moment.
Okay, so I am now sharing my screen. A
Okay.
few years-
I'll just introduce you briefly. I'm sure almost everyone knows you, but you know, it still gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Kay Reyerson, who is the Paul Frenzel Chair and a distinguished university teaching professor in the history department here at the U.
Okay, thank you. I got quite excited about StoryMaps without any technological background several years ago, and it really was first with Chris's project in my seminar on urban history that I saw the potential, and he ran with it in a way that that I think was surprising, maybe to him as well as to me, as far as that seminar was concerned. I have used the story map option as a seminar project in a Mediterranean seminar as well. And I had a very interesting paper mapping the correspondence of a Byzantine patriarch. And the student had a collection of letters from this patriarch, a book, and when he mapped these letters with their destination, their purpose on the map, you really had a sense of the reach of influence of this patriarch, which was hard to get to through one letter after another in a book. So I was again very excited about that. And when John comes back and can share his story map information, I've also used this in research. John and I doing a kind of collaborative research project, but the map is his, in which we examined Roger de Loria's activities during the Sicilian Vespers, a 20-year war from 1282 to 1302. And Roger wins 6 battles in the course of this war, but there are lots of other engagements that take place. My current research project is on piracy, and we make a tentative claim that some of what Roger was engaged in was piracy. At a very minimum, there's great ambiguity in terms of the kinds of raids that he is conducting. So the graduate seminar always had an introductory session with some of the specialists of the programs that Chris mentioned, Lattice, U-Spatial, Dash, Colin McFadden, Ben Wiggins, Shauna Croissant, and Chris because he too is a specialist in the Mediterranean offering. I was interested as well in applying this kind of technology, offering, in fact, this kind of digital training to students in my undergraduate courses. And what I want to talk about briefly today is what we did in 3 different courses. The Crusades, which is a lecture course, usually enrolling around 30 or more students. A seminar, 30-20, which was really hands-on history, but for which I chose the theme of the Black Death and introduced a story map option into that course. And then finally, the medieval cities class that Chris evoked. The first 2 were collaborative exercises. The medieval cities class asked students to do an individual creative story map. And in all instances, the student product, I think, is very interesting. It ranges greatly. Certainly, there's a huge span of expertise, obviously, and some students really got with the program and ran with it and did extraordinary things. But let me begin by looking at the Crusades as the first example of a collaborative exercise. And it was a very simple version of a story map. It's called a map tour. We asked students, well, in each of these cases, There were detailed prompts and demonstrations of story maps, so we didn't just take the students by surprise. We asked them to come to class with having read one of the 5 different narratives that I have on the screen that were part of our primary source text, the Amt Allen text for the Crusades. They offered us nice diversity, shall we say, that is certainly representative of the medieval Mediterranean. Ceolwulf was a Scandinavian traveler and pilgrim. John of Würzburg, a German pilgrim, 12th century always. Ibn Jubair is a very prominent Muslim geographer. Benjamin of Tudela was a Jewish traveler, and Usaban ibn Mundi was a lord in territories bordering the Crusader states in the Near East. Shazar in particular is the territory his family was associated with. In each of these cases, these were excerpts from the narratives, and the students in their 5 groups were to look specifically at their narrative, pull out a variety of bits of information, of data, geographic data, the observations of these travelers, seeing the sites. In some cases, you get a collaborative map that traces the voyage of Ceolwulf, at least partially, and stops along the way to look at the various places that were visited, focusing with modern day imagery and sometimes manuscript illuminations to illustrate these sites. In some instances, the focus from the excerpt, although the traveler certainly went a much longer distance, was more specific on a particular city, in this case, Jerusalem, as you might imagine. John of Würzburg then, within Jerusalem, visited various sites, various monuments. His perspective was something the students could examine in the legend that they created. You can see here in both cases, there are legends that accompany these maps and that bring forward the students thinking about the particular individual in question. My ulterior motive, certainly in this type of exercise, was to get students to read primary sources very closely, very carefully. And in order to do an effective map, they had to do that. And they had to collaborate in that exercise. Again, Ibn Jubair, there's a focus in the materials that the students had access to on his visits to the Crusader territories here, the southern territories, with the fortress of Kerak that they were giving an image of. They're discussing that. They're discussing other dimensions of his visit to the Near East. Again, Benjamin of Tudela visited sites all around the Mediterranean world. The excerpt in our source book places him in a couple of cities, Antioch in this case, being illustrated here. Again, the students would have traced these travels. And finally, sorry, let's see if I can move up here. Usama's discussion is really about Christian-Muslim relations in sites in the Holy Land, in particular Jerusalem, and that again was a different kind of discussion for students to highlight in the kind of legend that they provided along with the imagery. Geographic knowledge was something I think they acquired. They acquired some digital skills in mapping. I think in most cases, students were not lost in these exercises, but we often had them gather in a computer lab for some of the work on their collaborative story maps, so that nobody really got left behind. a different take was utilized in the seminar History 3020 with the theme of plague or the Black Death. In this instance, again, I wanted students to focus on the primary source material that I was having them read on the plague, on the effects of the plague, the 1348 version. And I wanted to encourage a collaborative exercise along 5 different themes. So the students were broken up into 5 groups. Rural mortality, they were to trace on the basis of data that they would assemble from the primary source readings, mostly chronicles, data in regard to each of these themes: rural mortality, mortality among the religious, the effects on wages and prices, animal deaths, and finally urban mortality. I think there was some frustration, which was appropriate. I mean, anyone doing research in the Middle Ages is frustrated by the lack of information in some cases. I think that they very rarely encountered anything quantitative, although there was sometimes estimates of mortality, but most of the data that they could assemble was qualitative. And that, having said that, they produced very interesting maps here, which tracked the references to mortality along one of the themes that I had suggested. In this case, both continental and British Isles mortality in rural areas. This was by no means a kind of representative or universal sample of data. It was related to specific materials we had in translation in our primary source books. Again, death among religious in monasteries in particular provides an interesting array. We certainly take away the fact that the plague was everywhere, and sometimes, in the case of religious houses, whole houses would be wiped out. They lived in close proximity, perfect for the contagion that the plague represented. Wages and prices were probably the most tricky topic, because the data was less fruitful, I think, in these sources, but there were occasional mentions of this. And I think it caused this particular group to look at the effects on the economy, really, of the plague. In each case, in each of these collaborative exercises in the Crusades and in the Black Death, students made presentations in class to share the fruits of their research and of their story maps, so that the whole group profited from an examination of this. Animal deaths are interesting, and the chronicles again are not numerous in their mentions of these, but they are certainly important. And yet the students in this particular legend make the very appropriate commentary that historians see very little evidence from first-hand accounts of rats dying. In fact, we miss that because we look upon the rat as one of the main transmitters of plague. But other animals could catch the plague, and these chronicles occasionally make mention of those. Finally, we had a map in which 2 of the students, one in particular, just ran with the idea of this technology. The larger points here are sources of data for urban mortality, and they're quite diverse. But the student was very concerned with the empty spaces, so to speak, as she said, and wanted to be able to fill in some other information as well. So she looked to one of the recent syntheses of the plague by Oli Benedictau and found a very large number of additional sites of information about urban mortality, which in fact gave us a better sense of what each of the other thematic maps might have presented if they had availed themselves of additional data. We even submitted this map to, I don't think it won the prize, but we did submit it because it was a very interesting and ambitious treatment of the exercise itself. Finally, the third course that Chris has already referenced was the course on medieval cities. In discussion with Chris, but it was really Chris's idea, we came up with the location of Sardinia as a landscape for the creation of the students' imaginary cities. Sardinia is probably one of the least urbanized of sites in medieval Europe. And so it made an interesting sort of experimental landscape. There was also a Roman road system. It's an island, so there were port possibilities, port city possibilities, and we wanted the students to choose the particular topography and geography for their story map and to justify that basically in the legend that they created. There was a kind of free form map design that was introduced and basically color coding the elements that were required in a medieval city. Sometimes students went beyond this list and created other elements as well. But one of the purposes of the exercise was to get them thinking about what made a medieval city, how was it laid out, how would you place the various components of most of these cities? So these are the colors. The key had a more elaborate description of possible ways to draw the elements here: roads, walls, water, etc. Chris has shown you the map of Sardinia. He put all of the individual maps together and mapped them in this fashion, and we get very creative names for these cities: Ingenious, Karensland, etc. And students obviously took different geographies to cite their cities and develop them. And I'll give you then here some examples. Again, they were required to provide a justification for their design elements and the placement of those elements. So if you can see a lot of economic activity, orange being the characteristic, religious activity, green, civic activities here in blue, waterways, port facilities, residences in gray. This is a complex city, and the legend and the vision of the city map, the views of the city would be multiplied in the individual student's map. I don't have the interactive dimensions that Chris was using in his. Here is a good justification. Bronzone was inspired by the city of Edinburgh. It has a castle on a hill surrounded by old fortifications overlooking the city. Students get into considerable detail discussing the nature of their creation, shall we say. Sometimes we get a little balder kind of creation of a city and maybe less refinement. These are probably agricultural lands, as I say, and villages or farmsteads. Again, the economic port facilities are quite clear here. Connections to a road system. The student makes reference to the location in a small bay with close proximity to a Roman road system. And then just two other images. I have 30 some of these on my Canvas site. They're really quite intriguing in terms of the design that the students made explicit for us in the legend of these exercises. So, you know, what's the takeaway? I think collaborative experience, use of primary sources, considerations of geography and topography, and the digital skills that students gained from exposure through this kind of exercise. I think in terms of medieval cities, but also in terms of the Crusades and the Black Death, dimensions of the textual history of these places come alive when you can see them in images. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And it looks like John, I thought I saw John hop back on, and he was the host. So.
All right. So without further ado, I will Microsoft. Okay, here we are. So this is a still from the story map that we made. And so I'm going to be kind of showing you an abbreviated version of this as I talk through basically 3 reasons why I think story maps have value in the classroom. And so the first that I kind of want to dwell on is digital mapping helps to develop a cartographic knowledge on 2 levels. On a very basic level, I think working and building story maps increase basic geographic literacy. As a former instructor, I assigned numerous map quizzes to my students and was sometimes surprised at the results that I received. And without dwelling on this too long, you know, I can say that this is anecdotal, but I think hearing complaints from former colleagues and, you know, teaching 4 or 5 different classes and doing this, I think we can conclude that there is room for improvement in terms of geographic literacy among the undergraduate population. And as you can see, we have all of these points, and these points are generated by building a data set in Microsoft Excel or some other sort of spreadsheet program. Excel, I think, is the most user-friendly. And where you need to put in the longitude and the latitude of each of these points. And I think just spending a lot of time through osmosis can be a much more useful way of understanding the globe around them beyond a map test where you say, here's 20 places, you're going to have to identify 8 of them that I picked from random. Please be prepared for the test on Monday. This is a much more prolonged experience. And through that, I think that that this is a really, it's really useful in that regard. Additionally, it grounds, it grounds the past in a geographic reality. And there are a lot of, what Kay and I did is we integrated into the data set that we built into Microsoft Excel is these links to Google Street View. And the images or the exact coordinates that we chose weren't always perfect. So for example, this is when Roger of Loria took over the captaincy of a Sicilian city named Augusta. And the map that in the image that we have here is a gate that was built by the Spanish in the 17th century. So not exactly perfect, but it does help to show students, and it helps to make students think about how these things really, they really happened. It's more than just words on a page describing an event. And there's a quote from Robert Chapin Lane's venerable but still exceedingly valuable Venice and Maritime History, where he quotes his old mentor, George Lincoln Burr, and he says that history has 2 eyes, chronology and geography. And chronology, it often comes out in the books that they read, but without kind of a dedicated work with maps, in this case, digital mapping, that is sometimes lost on them. And at a deeper level, I think the building a map and viewing a map like this is it helps students to understand how the events of the past actually shaped events how geography shaped the events of the past. And so if we skip ahead, if you scroll through our map, you'll see, I realize that you can't really see here probably very well, but basically what you have here is Roger of Loria is ordered to occupy an Angevin city. He served the Aragonese in the Sicilian Vespers, and the Angevins were their opponents. And of course, Anjou being, with most of their holdings being in southern France, they had to dispatch a ship. And so they dispatched a fleet from Marseille. And of course, they can't go through the Straits of Messina. Of course, we have the Scylla and Charybdis living there, which always makes things difficult. And Messina was the main Aragonese base of operations. And so they had to go around the southern side, they had to go around, as you can see, at which point they were trapped in the harbor of Malta, where Roger of Loria scored the first of his 6 major victories. And so building this map, it's of course, theoretically the way Sicily shapes movement from east to west in the Mediterranean. But I think actually building it and seeing it happen in like a case study is exceedingly valuable. And especially if a student is coming, to this project, to these presentations with less of a sense of geography, the light might go on and they say, geography does matter. Like this, this is something that maybe I should pay more attention to. And so even if their focus is the central Mediterranean or Sardinia or Egypt or something like that, they take this sensibility away with them. And I think that that's a really valuable lesson to take away. The other thing is the second way that I think that this is a valuable classroom exercise, and Kay kind of referenced this, is it helps students to reimagine the way we use primary sources to reconstruct a narrative. There's a lot that you can do with perspective to talk about kind of the more cerebral aspects of history, but simply, I think sometimes students can be at a loss when you say, well, first somebody did this, then they did this, how do we know that? And I think building this and seeing this is a way of doing that. And so we built into our data set links to specific sources. So here again, you have a more complete view of that pop-up that we have. So if you click on any of the icons, you get these. And if you click on the first source, you get a link directly to this. This is a group of, or this is a collection of documents of practice from the kings of Aragon, in which Roger of Loria is invested with the captaincy of Augusta. And so you can do that, and you can see how there are competing accounts talking about this specific plot of land. And I think that that's a really valuable way. And I think it kind of, by embedding these sources, I think it's a way of reimagining a footnote and what a footnote is. And I will never forget the an experience that I had actually taking a class. I took a graduate course in art history, and there were a number of undergraduates, and I overheard one of them saying, like, I realized that the best way to do research is to actually like look in the footnotes, like there are actual sources there. And so I think that this is a way to kind of encourage students to like look in the footnotes and to really think about an alternative way of envisioning and presenting sources. Kind of whipping through things here, so we have a little bit more time to talk. But the last point that I want to make is that I think that that digital mapping is a way of giving students a new skill set. And for better or for worse, higher education has emerged as one of the few paths to a well-paying middle class career. Define that how you will. And so I think students expect to learn skills that will serve them well on that path. And after I left the graduate program, I've held 3 different jobs, 2 low-level positions working for a financial institution, and now my current position, which is more academic adjacent. And in each of those positions, I've used Excel extensively. And this is, not every student is going to have that experience before they hop into one of these careers. And I'm not trying to say that Excel is some opaque, difficult program to use, but the sheer use that it gets, outside of school, in getting them comfortable with these sorts of things is a really useful thing. So at the very least, when they get that first interview and they say, well, have you used Excel? Have you used a spreadsheet program? At the very least, they're not going to be lying when they say yes. And the second thing, the second aspect of this is, learning these technologies, it does have real world applications. When I was searching for a job that would suit my skill set, I came across numerous, listings for nonprofit work. There's extensive use for this technology outside of the academy. My own company, Eastview Information Services, which is more academic adjacent, has a digital mapping division. And so doing a single project is not going to get students to be completely proficient in this technology. But as Kay has indicated, she's had students that have really taken this and run with it. And I'm sure Chris would be happy to share with you, Spatial and the other, the digital mapping center in the library has these really useful seminars and all-day seminars where students learn to use this technology more deeply. And so, there's obviously problems with kind of gearing one's education towards these more practical ends. But this is kind of what, the humanities has to face. And so I think that there is value in looking in that direction. So yeah, I will send it back to, I'm going to stop my sharing, and I will send it back to our moderators, and they can decide where we're going to go from here.
Great, thank you, John, and thanks to Kay and Chris as well. And this was really great to see the different projects that all of you guys have been working on together and separately as well, and to see what the students have done and hear about the skills that they have gotten from this. I hope everyone can still hear me. I keep cutting in and out. And I did just want to point out that Chris Saladin did put in those links in the chat that he mentioned. I am just going to put into a link that I forgot to mention that we are recording this, and we also recorded an earlier session, a webinar on teaching as well. And that video is available on our YouTube channel. So this one will be available on the YouTube channel. So if people miss things, it will be available there. And now as moderator too, I guess if there's any questions that anyone has or comments, for our presenters. Lauren has a question, it looks like.
I do. I'm really curious if any of you have talked with students later after the semester's over, or another semester's gone by, another year, and sort of after they've had a chance to reflect on it, because I've engaged in other sort of different sorts of pedagogy, and it sort of sticks with them. And I'm curious if this has also stuck with them in positive ways.
Yeah, I can think of at least of a couple examples in my own experience. I had a student who, so I had a strange experience where I actually, through digital mapping, worked for I was a TA for a class that was cross-appointed with a design and electrical engineering course that had to do with the power grid in Minnesota. I'm an ancient historian. I know nothing about this. But I had a student in that class who actually turned out to be a history major. And that student had done we did a story map in that class, and they did that. And then I encountered that student in 3 other classes I worked with the history department later. And multiple times they already had the skills of doing story maps. And I know in some cases, at least 2 cases, they had an optional assignment if they wanted to do story maps. And I know that this same student chose to repeatedly do it and actually like carried through the skills from doing it previously in like at least 4 different courses total. This one student did in a matter of 2 years. So I know that at least in that student's experience, they definitely held on to those skills and they really enjoyed doing it and they found it to be a valuable thing. So that's at least one experience I can speak of where they definitely kept it up. And maybe that's because they kept doing it over and over again, that they kept reinforcing the skills, but it was definitely, in that case, something that stuck with them.
I think one has a wide range of receptivity, I guess I would say, to this type of exercise. And although the cities class took place last spring, and the map exercise was once we had gone virtual. So we were scrambling to do this virtually. And the presentations at the end of the semester, certainly the students were proud of what they had done, however much they might have struggled in the process. I think the collaborative exercises are always a little dicey, if I can say that, because some students will do more than others. Certainly the 2 students who were most engaged in the Black Death urban mortality map were very, very keen on what they had been doing. I think in some of the story map, the map tour exercises for the Crusades course, there maybe wasn't quite as much enthusiasm. It was a less challenging exercise, but I think there was some confusion among students in that exercise. So it's really important to have technical assistance available to any student, and to get the students to open up to what they aren't understanding, because the ArcGIS process is complicated. I mean, just clicking on the right place on your screen to move through, to share your material. I mean, Chris really shepherded me through with the students in each of these undergraduate courses. And without his expertise, it would have been impossible, shall we say, to bring them to fruition.
Great. All right. Well, we are at 6 o'clock. I think if there's like one more question, we can have another question, or we can also wrap up right now. Sounds like that's a wrap, but I'm sure people will be consulting it online, which is the great part. So I want to thank you guys for doing this. It's been really helpful for me. I mean, I've taught a couple times with them, but it's always useful to hear how other people are using StoryMaps and how they manage to train undergrads to do it in addition to teaching all your material that you're teaching. So all right, well, I think, and see me, I think I cut out again, but thank you.